Hands off my rifle! That was the warning Staff Sergeant Elara Kross gave when Vice Admiral Richard Harlow tried to yank her Barrett cow from her hands. She moved like lightning. One twist, one lock, and the three-star dropped to a knee, clutching his wrist in pain as 40 operators stared, stunned into silence. But humiliation wasn't enough for him. Through a thin smile, he demanded proof. 6 steel plates from 800 meters to nearly 2 kilometers. He laughed, certain she would miss, certain her career would collapse with the first failed shot. Instead, shot after shot slammed steel until the final target rang like a church bell across the valley. The Admiral froze, jaw tight. Around him, Rangers and SEALs could only gape, rank shattered, arrogance silenced, and respect earned in a single, echoing volley. This is VeteranBiker. Comment 1 if you're new, 2 if you've been with us, 3 if you ride with us every week. Like, subscribe, and stay to the end. The Admiral's hand touched steel, and that was his mistake. Elara Kross didn't flinch when Vice Admiral Richard Harlow's manicured fingers wrapped around the barrel of her Barrett. She didn't raise her voice or snap to her feet. She simply twisted her grip, a clean joint lock flowing from instinct. In a heartbeat, the room full of Rangers, SEALs, and staff officers went silent, 40 pairs of eyes fixed on the collision of authority and defiance. "Hands off my rifle, sir," she said, steady, her tone cold enough to bite through the Afghan heat. The Barrett rested across her lap, half-cleaned, still smelling of solvent and gun oil. Around her, maps plastered the plywood walls of the briefing hut, marking enemy routes with bold red strokes. But none of that mattered now. What mattered was that a 3-star admiral had just violated the one rule every shooter lived by: never touch another sniper's weapon. Harlow's lips curled, disbelief etched into his features. He leaned down, lowering his voice but not his arrogance. "Is this how you treat senior officers, Sergeant? Guarding a toy you can't even handle?" The weight of his words pressed against the silence. Elara didn't move. She didn't need to. The strength in her grip spoke louder than anything she could say. Rangers shifted in their folding chairs, uneasy. SEALs watched with the kind of sharp-eyed stillness that came from years of reading a room seconds before violence. No one interfered. They all knew they were witnessing something larger than a scuffle over a rifle. This was a challenge to her very right to sit in that room. Harlow smirked, certain she would yield. "I competed at Annapolis, targets at 500 yards, wind calls, discipline. Don't think you're the only one here who understands marksmanship." His voice carried the smugness of someone who had never lain motionless for 14 hours in freezing wind, waiting for one man to step into view. Elara met his eyes, her own expression unreadable. Arguing was pointless. Skill, not words, would decide this fight. The barrel trembled slightly as he tried to pull harder, testing her. Her calloused hand didn't budge. His polished nails slipped against the steel. For a moment, the Barrett became a bridge between two worlds, his, gilded by politics and ceremony, and hers, carved from discipline and combat. The deadlock might have dragged into open humiliation, but the door slammed wide with a bang. Specialist Dawson stumbled in, breathless, clutching a folder so tight the edges bent. His boots scraped against the floorboards as he blurted out, 6 high-value targets on the move. North Valley, 4-hour window." The spell shattered. Operators snapped their heads toward him, attention torn from the silent battle of wills. Elara released Harlow's wrist as fluidly as she had taken it, lowering the Barrett across her thigh. The Admiral tugged at his sleeve, jaw clenched, as if adjusting fabric could erase the fact that she had just forced him back. But pride is a harder wound to conceal. His voice cut through the room, louder than necessary, sharp enough to slice the air. This mission requires Overwatch, real Overwatch, not theatrics. He thrust a finger toward the fresh-faced lieutenant behind him. He'll take the role. A ripple swept the room like static. Men stiffened, some blinking in disbelief. Then Chief Petty Officer Reyes of SEAL Team 5 shoved his chair back and stood. His tone carried the weight of a man who had buried teammates before. "Sir, with respect, Hawks covered our last 3 missions. We're still here because of her." Harlow waved him off like swatting a fly. "Anecdotes, embellishments. We're not risking this operation on stories." That was the breaking point. Elara rose, the Barrett sliding into her arms with effortless familiarity. She lifted her chin, her voice ringing across the cramped room so every ranger, SEAL and staff officer could hear. 6 targets! Place them wherever you like. If I miss even once, I'll take whatever punishment you decide, court-martial included. But if I make them all, you step aside and let me run Overwatch. The room froze. The very air seemed to tighten. Some soldiers leaned forward, eyes gleaming with anticipation at the challenge. Others stiffened, knowing one slip would end her career in a single afternoon. Harlow's eyes narrowed. His pride demanded a response. He flexed the wrist she had twisted, then gave a curt nod. "Fine. 6 shots. We'll see if your reputation holds." Outside, word spread like fire. By the time steel plates were hammered into the earth, nearly half the base had gathered along the range. The sun blazed overhead, dust rising in shimmering waves. Operators placed bets in hushed tones. All eyes turned toward the woman lying prone with the Barrett anchored into her shoulder. But this was no performance. For Elara, it was the moment she had been preparing for since her grandfather had taught her to steady her breathing before squeezing a trigger. Every lesson, every night in a cold hide, every hour cleaning this weapon, it had all led to this. And when she exhaled, letting the crosshairs settle, she knew one truth. This wasn't about pride. It was about trust. Trust from every man who would step into that valley. Trust that could not be commanded by stars or stripes. Trust that had to be earned the way it always was, through the ringing of steel at impossible range. The crowd fell into silence as she prepared her first shot. The test had begun. The steel plates stood in the distance like ghosts shimmering in the heat. 6 of them, each farther than the last, the final target so far out it seemed almost to bend against the horizon. Soldiers whispered as they gathered on the hard-packed dirt behind the firing line, dust crunching beneath their boots. What had begun as a briefing inside a plywood hut had become an open-air trial of skill, pride, and survival. Elara Hawk Kross lay flat against the ground, her Barrett resting steady on its bipod. Her cheek pressed to the stock, her eyes fixed through glass that revealed every shimmer of mirage and every ripple of dust. She ignored the crowd, she ignored the heat. All that existed now were the crosshairs and the targets waiting in the distance. Vice Admiral Harlow stood under the edge of a canopy, his good hand tucked neatly behind his back, the other stiff from the lock she had forced on him minutes earlier. His expression was unreadable, but the tightness of his jaw betrayed more than he would admit. He had chosen the targets, placed them deliberately, stretching them beyond comfort. If she failed even once, he would win back his pride. If she didn't, then the authority he carried in this place would fracture. The silence was heavy, broken only by the faint flap of a range flag and the metallic clink of the Barrett's bolt as Elara chambered the first round. 800 meters. To most shooters, a serious test. To her, a warm-up. She adjusted elevation, let her body settle into the dirt and slowed her breathing. Through the scope, the plate was sharp, a square of steel waiting. The wind tugged lightly from the left. She shifted half a mil. The reticle steadied, her finger curled. The shot cracked. The echo rolled back across the valley. A second later, steel rang out clear and loud. The plate shuddered, dust jumping from its frame. The crowd erupted with muffled cheers, quickly hushed when Harlow's eyes snapped toward them. The Admiral gave a sharp gesture, and silence returned. Elara didn't look up. She worked the bolt, casing ejecting with a metallic snap, brass bouncing against the dirt. She slid in another round. 1 down, 5 to go. The second plate sat at a full kilometer. The distance was enough to expose weaker shooters, especially in this heat. Mirage shimmered, bending light, tricking the eye. Elara watched carefully, reading the distortions the way others read words on a page. She adjusted, finding the true center through the blur. The reticle floated, her body still as stone. Breath out, trigger press. The Barrett thundered again. The plate rocked, the sound carrying back across the field. 2. The murmurs grew louder now. Soldiers elbowed each other, eyes wide. A ranger whispered, "She's not missing." A SEAL smirked, muttering back, "Wait for the long ones." Harlow's expression hardened, his pride straining under each impact. He motioned again. The third target was called. At 1,200 meters, the valley turned hostile. Crosswinds snaked between ridges, twisting unpredictably, as if the air itself wanted to betray her. The gathered soldiers shifted uneasily, sensing the razor's edge she was about to step onto. Elara didn't rush. Her hands moved with surgical precision, tiny adjustments on the turret, eyes reading the invisible currents like a language only she spoke. She counted the breaths between gusts, felt the rhythm drum through her chest, and timed the squeeze of the trigger to match the valley's pulse. The Barrett thundered, the recoil surging into her shoulder, dust bursting up beneath her elbows. A heartbeat later, the steel jerked violently, the sound of impact ringing across the range. 3 shots, 3 strikes. This time the whispers carried awe, not doubt. The crowd no longer muttered about luck. They murmured of inevitability. "She's not going to miss. Nobody can do this. You're witnessing history." Yet Harlow refused to yield. His voice cut through the murmurs, clipped and sharp. He called the next distance with deliberate bite, 1,400 meters, a range where bullets lost faith in the hand that fired them, where the smallest imperfection could send a round into empty sky. Elara raised her gaze, not to the flags alone, but to the stubborn sway of trees along the far ridge. She read the hidden pressure of the wind, the subtle fight in each branch, straining against unseen hands. Her fingers clicked across the scope, her world narrowing until nothing existed but the crosshairs floating steady on the steel. The trigger broke. The valley answered with the unmistakable clang of struck metal. The plate rocked, shuddering under the hit. 4. The reaction was instant. Men who had once smirked leaned forward now, eyes wide, caught between disbelief and hunger for the next shot. The range buzzed with energy no scowl from Harlow could contain. Harlow's knuckles whitened around the binoculars he held. He called the next plate. 1,600 meters, 2 seconds of flight, an eternity in which doubt could creep into any shooter's mind. Elara set herself deeper into the dirt. Her muscles ached from holding steady, sweat trickled down her temple, but she welcomed it. It reminded her she was alive, that every sense mattered. She tracked the wind, adjusted for drop, let time stretch thin as wire. The Barrett roared. 1, 2, steel clanged at the far ridge. 5. The crowd could no longer contain itself. A wave of cheers rolled across the range, men clapping, some laughing in disbelief. Even the most cynical among them had no more arguments. But one plate remained, 1,810 meters, nearly beyond the rifle's rated effective range, a distance where even flawless fundamentals bowed to luck. The range fell quiet. Even the wind seemed to pause. Soldiers shifted uneasily, their anticipation a living thing. Elara felt it press against her shoulders. She blocked it out. The world shrank to her scope, her breathing, her heartbeat. She read the dust dancing along the valley floor, the swirling gusts whispering of chaos. This was the shot that mattered most. Her finger rested on the trigger, but she didn't fire. She waited, patient, listening to the valley. A sudden crosswind rushed through, scattering dust, threatening to ruin any attempt. She held calm, unflinching. Then it steadied. She exhaled. The reticle floated into place. Trigger squeeze. The Barrett thundered, recoil slamming her shoulder. 3 seconds of silence. The crowd held its breath. Then, clear, resonant, unmistakable, the final plate rang like a bell. The valley exploded. Soldiers cheered, clapped, shouted her name. The sound rolled across the range louder than the rifle's report. Elara lifted her head, sweat streaking her cheek, expression calm. To her, it was not celebration, it was necessity. Every shot she had made on this range was proof that in the valley tomorrow, when lives hung by threads, she could deliver. Vice Admiral Harlow stood frozen, his binoculars slipping slightly in his grip. His pride had been ripped away, not by insult or argument, but by precision no words could deny. He stood stiff, chest rising with shallow breaths. Then, in a gesture no one expected, he raised his left hand to his brow and saluted. The motion was awkward, wounded wrist trembling, but it carried meaning that reverberated through the crowd. He lowered his hand, voice heavy with concession. "Staff Sergeant Kross will provide Overwatch." The cheers surged again, this time unrestrained. Men who had once doubted now looked at her with something closer to reverence. They had seen arrogance broken and skill triumph. Elara rose slowly, slinging the Barrett across her back. She didn't smile, didn't gloat. She simply met Harlow's eyes, steady and unreadable, then turned toward the operators waiting for her. Trust was not declared, it was earned, and she had earned it in the only way that mattered. Tomorrow, the valley would demand more. But tonight, steel had spoken. The echoes of the last shot still seemed to vibrate in the valley when the crowd began to break apart. Operators dispersed in clusters, voices low, every man and woman aware that what they had witnessed would be recounted for years. Yet for Elara, there was no time to savor the shift in perception. The targets in the hills were not plates of steel. They were living, breathing enemies plotting destruction. Inside the command tent, the air was stifling with cigarette smoke and the constant hum of radios. Maps were unrolled again, pushed flat by coffee mugs and rifle bolts used as paperweights. Intelligence officers scrawled notations in red grease pencil, marking the projected path of the 6 insurgent leaders. Their convoy would move through the valley before nightfall, guarded by security teams positioned along high ridges. It was a rare alignment of opportunity. Leaders seldom gathered in the open, and if this chance slipped, they might scatter for months. Vice Admiral Harlow stood near the head of the table, his earlier arrogance now replaced by a rigid professionalism. His left hand rested against his side while his right, still stiff from Elara's joint lock, twitched occasionally. He avoided her gaze, though the weight of his recent concession hung over every order he issued. "They'll move along this route," he said, tapping a thick finger against a ridgeline. "Ambush points here, here, and here." Rangers leaned over the map, nodding grimly. SEALs compared notes with intelligence specialists, debating elevation and ingress routes. The hum of collaboration filled the space. In the corner, Elara adjusted her spotting scope and range cards, already calculating vantage points before assignments were finalized. Master Sergeant Collins from the Rangers cleared his throat. "We'll need high ground eyes before we advance. Hawk, you're up." The acknowledgement was casual, spoken without hesitation, as though her place was unquestioned. That alone marked a sea change. Earlier that morning, men had wondered if she even belonged in the briefing. Now her role was taken as fact. Elara traced the valley contours on the map. She knew from experience that terrain could betray even the best plans. Wind channels could turn steady shots into disasters. Ridgelines could conceal unexpected patrols. She circled a cliff face on the northern edge. "Set me here. I'll have clear lanes across the route. Anyone tries to reinforce, I'll cut them off before they reach the convoy." Chief Reyes leaned over, squinting. "That perch is 2 clicks uphill. You'll need to move fast to be in place before they show." She gave a short nod. "I've climbed worse." The Admiral's lips tightened as though he wanted to object, but he said nothing. His silence was as telling as any order. Preparations began immediately. Rangers checked comms gear, SEALs packed breaching charges, medics inventoried supplies. The atmosphere was electric, each soldier propelled by the urgency of a mission with stakes too high for error. Elara moved to her own corner, spreading out her kit on a tarp. Every piece had its place. She ran her hands across the suppressor, the sandbag rests, the spare magazines wrapped in tape to silence any rattle. She inserted fresh batteries into her laser rangefinder, then tested the wind meter, watching the tiny vanes spin in the afternoon gusts. The ritual was not just mechanical. It was a way to steady her own breathing, to channel the tension into preparation. Her mind flickered back to training at Fort Benning years earlier. The instructors had been merciless, forcing her to repeat calculations until her hands cramped, drilling her until exhaustion blurred her vision. They had told her plainly, "A sniper lives or dies by discipline. 1 lapse, 1 shortcut, and you bury a friend." That memory guided every adjustment she made now. As she packed her gear, Specialist Dawson approached, still flushed from the adrenaline of bringing in the intel. "Ma'am, I just wanted to say—" He hesitated, rubbing the back of his neck. "What you did out there, it changed things. Guys will think twice before doubting again." Elara studied his earnest face. He was young, barely out of his first deployment, with that mix of awe and anxiety common to soldiers, still learning how quickly luck could run out. She gave him a simple answer. "Don't measure respect by words, Dawson. Measure it by who makes it back alive." He nodded, the lesson sinking deeper than any applause. The sun had already started dipping when the convoy rolled out. Dust plumes rose behind armored vehicles as the task force moved into position. Elara, carrying the Barrett across her back, hiked toward the cliff face she had marked. Each step sent small rocks skittering down the slope. Her lungs burned, but she welcomed the ache. It kept her sharp. She moved with purpose, aware that every passing minute shortened the margin before the enemy leaders reached the kill zone. By the time she reached the outcropping, sweat had plastered her hair against her scalp, and her uniform was streaked with dirt. She dropped prone, unzipping the rifle case, and extended the bipod against the rock surface. From here, the valley spread before her like an open book. She could see the road snaking between hills, the shadows lengthening as the sun lowered. Through her scope, small details emerged. Birds startled from brush, dust rising from hidden trails, the faint glint of metal in places where insurgents had already begun to set up security posts. She adjusted the parallax and checked her range card. Distances etched themselves into her mind. 900, 1150, 1600. She whispered them quietly, not for anyone else but to anchor her own focus. On the radio, Colin's voice crackled. "Overwatch status?" She pressed her mic. "Hawk in position. Visual on valley. Hostiles setting up along Ridge 2. A pause, then Reyes replied. "Copy. We're moving into staging. Call shots when ready." Elara inhaled slowly, the familiar calm washing over her. The range demonstration had been a battle for credibility. This was different. This was life and death. Every operator below would depend on her unseen shield, trusting that she would erase threats before they ever pulled a trigger. Through her glass, movement appeared. A cluster of armed men taking positions behind rocks overlooking the route. She counted them, catalogued their rifles, noted fields of fire. Her finger rested near the trigger guard, not yet pressing. Patience mattered more than eagerness. Suddenly, a voice behind startled her. One of the rangers, climbing to establish a relay antenna, froze when he saw her lined up on target. He whispered, "All yours, Hawk." Then he quietly backed away, careful not to disturb her line of sight. Even that small gesture showed how quickly perceptions had shifted. She shifted focus, scanning further up the valley. Dust plumes signaled vehicles drawing closer, the convoy carrying the 6 leaders. They were minutes away from entering the kill zone. Her chest constricted as the weight of responsibility pressed down. Memories surfaced, Taylor's fall, her father's stern warning that precision was more than power, that it was duty. That truth crystallized in her now. One mistake could ripple outward like shrapnel, costing not only her pride, but the lives of men depending on her unseen shield. She drove the buttstock deeper into her shoulder, muscles tightening, her eye locked into the reticle until nothing else existed. The operation had moved beyond planning. It was alive now, beating with the tempo of heartbeats and trigger pulls. From her perch high on the northern cliff, Elara steadied her breathing. Through the scope, the valley opened in brutal detail. Ridges jagged like broken teeth, scrub scattered in irregular patches, dirt tracks worn smooth by years of convoys grinding the same paths. Every line of terrain carried history, and every crease in the earth could hide death. She scanned the slope below, where insurgents crawled into position. Spotters took their places, rifles braced against rocks, the faint flash of sunlight off metal betraying their presence. Even before they fired, their intent was clear: to choke the valley with ambush fire the moment her comrades entered. Elara's mind snapped into calculation. Angles, fields of fire, arcs of vision, all assessed in seconds. She plotted where her rangers would advance, where seals would break left, how lines of fire could cross and kill. The numbers and shapes fell into place in her head with the ruthless efficiency of clockwork, every variable measured against one outcome: keep them alive. The radio crackled softly in her earpiece. Colin's voice, low but sharp. "Overwatch, call it." Her reply came steady, stripped of hesitation. "Ridge 2, 4 rifles in play, PKM behind the boulder. I'll take the cut." A pause followed, the weight of the decision heavy in the air, then cleared hot. At once the world shrank to the circle of glass before her eye. She tuned out the murmurs on the net, the shifting of boots below, the hum of her own pulse. Wind brushed her cheek, curling down the valley like an unseen predator. Dust whirled in faint spirals, a language she had learned to read better than words. She clicked 2 notches right, the adjustment exact, then exhaled. The trigger broke clean. The Barrett's roar shook her chest, the recoil familiar as an old friend. Half a heartbeat later, a man folded backward, his weapon tumbling end over end down the slope. She worked the bolt in one smooth motion. Brass ejected, smoke curling, another round sliding into the chamber. Through the scope, panic flared as a second fighter rose from cover, eyes wide, rifle half-shouldered. Her reticle steadied on him. The next shot struck true, his body pitching sideways before he even realized the danger. The last 2 scrambled desperately, scattering to find shelter, but there was none. Elara tracked the PKM gunner as he swung behind his tripod, ready to rake the valley with heavy fire. She adjusted, squeezed, and the round slammed into his chest with a violence that lifted him off his seat. His weapon clattered uselessly. The valley had drawn its first breath of battle, and it belonged entirely to her rifle. She keyed her mic, her tone clipped and businesslike. Ridge 2 neutralized. Across the net someone almost cheered, but discipline snapped back fast. Silence mattered more than celebration. Voices stayed low, professional, threading coordinates and commands as the task force continued forward. Then came the dust. At first, faint plumes against the horizon, then growing larger, rising in curling towers behind engines. Vehicles materialized, dark shapes grinding along the road, hulking silhouettes against the pale earth. Through her scope, Elara tracked them one by one, armored pickups, technicals bristling with mounted weapons, escorts fanning out like teeth in a closing jaw. In the center, concealed by armor and tinted glass, rode the 6 men who had drawn this entire operation together. Their guards scanned nervously, rifles shifting at every shadow. They had prepared for threats from the road, from ahead, from ambush at ground level. What they had not prepared for was the unseen predator already watching from above. Further down the route, another group of fighters scrambled into place, setting RPG tubes on a slope that overlooked the kill zone. Elara marked them instantly. At that distance, the shot demanded patience. She drew in a slow breath, whispered a number to herself, and pressed. The rocket man fell backward, launcher clattering beside him. His partner dove for cover but was too slow. A second round streaked across the canyon, knocking him flat. Launcher team neutralized, she said. Rangers advanced along the low ground, their movements confident under her shield. SEALs maneuvered through dry creek beds, closing in on the kill zone. From her vantage, Elara could see the choreography unfold, the silent ballet of operators moving with purpose, every step counting on her to erase unseen dangers. Then the unexpected happened. A squad of insurgents, hidden deeper in the brush, opened fire prematurely. Bullets ricocheted across rocks, sending shards of stone into the air. One ranger dropped, wounded in the leg, as others scrambled for cover. Elara shifted instantly, eyes searching for muzzle flashes. She caught the faint spark of sunlight on metal just beyond a boulder. Without hesitation, she fired. The hostile collapsed. Another tried to drag him back, exposing himself for just a second too long. A second impact ended the effort. Contact broken, she transmitted, though her heart hammered faster now. Mistakes by the enemy could cascade quickly, jeopardizing the entire ambush. Through her earpiece, Reyes's voice cut through. "We're inside the perimeter. Hold them down, Hawk," she acknowledged, swinging her barrel toward a technical truck edging out of formation. Its gunner prepared to rake the valley with heavy fire. She judged the distance, compensated for crosswind, and fired. The round punched through his chest, flinging him from the turret. The truck veered sideways, tires squealing. The convoy began to stall, confusion spreading among the drivers. Some shouted at one another, others tried to reverse, creating a bottleneck. The insurgent leaders must have realized they were compromised, but chaos gave Elara's team the advantage. Rangers surged forward, pouring fire into the immobilized vehicles. SEALs struck from the flanks, their precision overwhelming the disoriented guards. From her perch, Elara kept plucking threats. Any hostile who dared aim at the assault teams met the crack of her rifle, but the enemy refused to collapse quietly. One last group sprinted uphill, attempting to outflank the Rangers with suppressive fire. Elara exhaled, calming her pulse. They were nearly 1,600 meters out, moving fast. She led the shot, aimed ahead of their path, and pressed. The first man pitched sideways, his comrades stumbling falling over him. Another fell before they reached cover. The rest scattered, abandoning the attempt. Minutes dragged like hours until the last echo of gunfire faded. Dust hung in the air, thick and choking, as radios crackled confirmation. 6 objectives secure, all captured alive. Elara slowly lifted her head from the scope, blinking against the sudden brightness of the setting sun. Her body ached from holding position, but she ignored the pain. Below, her comrades moved efficiently, binding prisoners, securing documents, loading wounded onto stretchers. The mission had unfolded exactly as it needed to, yet she knew one more task remained. Her spotter scope caught a lone fighter retreating up the far ridge, likely a scout who could warn reinforcements. At nearly 2 kilometers, the distance pushed the limits of her weapon. She weighed the risk, let him go and chance pursuit later, or take the shot and end the threat now. Her jaw set. She adjusted elevation, watching the man pause briefly on the crest. She drew in the valley air, tasting dust and grit, then touched the trigger. The delay was agonizing, but when the steel-jacketed round reached him, his figure dropped against the skyline. Silence returned. "Area clear," she said quietly. In the command net, Colin's voice was firm. "Outstanding Overwatch. Without you, we'd be writing letters home tonight." She offered no reply. Praise mattered little compared to the sight of medics working furiously to stabilize the wounded ranger. 1 life injured, none lost. That was the calculus she measured herself against. As dusk settled, the task force regrouped. Prisoners were blindfolded and loaded into transports. Captured documents and electronics were catalogued for intelligence. The valley that had moments earlier echoed with violence now lay eerily calm. The bodies of enemy combatants scattered among burning vehicles. From her cliff, Elara packed the Barrett with deliberate care. She brushed sand from the bipod, stowed her optics, and slung the heavy weapon across her back. When she finally descended, her boots skidding on loose rock, the operators who passed her met her eyes directly. Some nodded, others clapped her shoulder. Not one doubted anymore. Vice Admiral Harlow stood apart, his expression unreadable. He had witnessed every moment through binoculars, his pride stripped bare by the performance. As Elara approached, he inclined his head slightly, not a full bow, not even a formal salute, but enough to signal recognition. For him, the gesture was monumental. She didn't stop to savor it. The mission wasn't about validation, it was about survival. Still, as she passed him, she heard his quiet words, "Well done, Sergeant. Better than I could have imagined." She gave the briefest nod, then continued toward the staging area. The smell of diesel filled her nose as engines roared to life. The convoy, now under Allied control, prepared to roll back toward base. Night crept across the mountains, painting the sky in deep hues. As the task force withdrew, Elara walked beside the transports, rifle across her chest, eyes still scanning the ridgelines. Habit kept her sharp. Victory was no excuse for complacency. Behind her, the battlefield smoldered, a testament to precision and resolve. Ahead, new challenges waited. For now, she carried with her the quiet certainty that when arrogance had tested her, skill had answered. The return convoy crawled back toward camp, resolute under a sky turning violet, engines rumbling through dust that clung to every soldier's skin. Prisoners huddled in the rear of armored trucks, their wrists bound, faces set in resignation. Wounded comrades were tended by medics who spoke in clipped tones, refusing to let exhaustion slow their work. Elara walked alongside one of the vehicles, her rifle slung but ready, each step measured. She knew better than to assume the danger had passed. Insurgents often struck during withdrawals, ambushing convoys strung out along narrow mountain roads. Her eyes swept the ridgelines, ears tuned to the rhythm of tires over gravel, always listening for what didn't belong. Back at camp, floodlights bathed the perimeter in pale beams as the task force rolled in. Soldiers spilled from vehicles, some heading straight for the mess hall, others collapsing on benches with gear still strapped to their bodies. The energy was a strange mix. Relief blended with weariness, triumph shadowed by memory of how close disaster had lurked. The command tent buzzed with activity. Intelligence officers pored over the laptops, uploading captured hard drives, examining notebooks taken from the prisoners. Radios hissed with reports from higher command already eager to exploit the breakthrough. The 6 men seized were no ordinary fighters. Their capture promised to fracture entire networks of operations across the region. Vice Admiral Harlow entered the tent last, his face shadowed with fatigue. His uniform bore new dust stains, his sleeve still stiff around the wrist she had wrenched earlier. He stood at the center, waiting until the chatter subsided. His voice carried less bravado now, though it still carried weight. Mission accomplished. No friendly losses. 6 priority targets detained, intelligence cache secured. Outstanding work from every team. His eyes flickered briefly toward Elara, a pause that did not go unnoticed. We'll report full details to headquarters, but tonight, this task force set a standard. The operators gave quiet nods, no cheers or applause. Combat veterans rarely indulged in celebrations while adrenaline still lingered. Yet the recognition was felt all the same. After the briefing broke up, Elara moved outside, finding a quiet place near the edge of the compound where the lights didn't drown the stars. She laid the Barrett across her knees and began the familiar routine of cleaning. Each swipe of the cloth was deliberate, not rushed, as though she were replaying every shot in her mind and filing it away for study. She was halfway through checking the bolt when a shadow fell across her. Admiral Harlow approached, slower than usual, his posture less rigid. For a long moment he said nothing, simply watching her work. Finally, he spoke in a voice low enough not to carry. "You were right," he admitted. The words came halting as though dragged against his will. "I doubted you. I questioned whether you belonged in that chair. Today you proved I was wrong." Elara glanced up but kept her hands steady on the weapon. "It wasn't about me, sir. It was about the mission." Harlow's mouth tightened into something halfway between a grimace and a smile. "Perhaps. But you've done more than complete an operation. You've forced me to reconsider how we judge ability. That's no small thing." He lingered another moment, then added, "There will be paperwork. Commendations, maybe even recommendations above my level, but whether or not the system recognizes it, I saw what you did out there." With that, he turned and walked back toward the command tent, leaving her in the dim glow of starlight. She let out a long breath, the tightness in her shoulders finally easing. The Admiral's acknowledgement had been unexpected, but it wasn't what she sought. Her measure of victory had never been medals or applause. It was simple, every comrade who lived to see sunrise. By dawn, fresh orders rippled across the camp. A secure line from headquarters confirmed what the prisoners had carried. Plans for 3 large-scale attacks in separate provinces. Raids were already being drawn up, lives spared before the first shot was even fired. For Elara, the morning brought something quieter, but no less profound. In the mess hall, men who once avoided her now shifted over, pulling out chairs, leaning in to hear her breakdown of calculations, her process of reading wind and terrain. Respect came not as flowery praise, but in the way hardened operators listened, pens scratching notes as if her words were doctrine. She wasn't just tolerated anymore, she was trusted. That afternoon, she was summoned to a temporary office. Collins, Reyes and Harlow waited around a desk bare, except for one folder stamped recommendation. Harlow, his injured hand stiff at his side, gestured with his other. "I'm submitting you for a silver star," he said evenly. "Not for the stunt on the range. That was about egos. This is for the Overwatch that saved this task force." The words carried more weight than he likely intended. Elara kept her face composed. Awards were acknowledgements, not destinations. Still, she inclined her head. "Understood, sir." Reyes grinned, unable to hold back. "About damn time someone put your name in ink." The meeting lasted minutes, but its significance lingered. Harlow's signature on that page was more than paperwork. It was a recognition that couldn't be brushed aside, no matter how many skeptics still lingered in the ranks. That night, under a sky sharp with stars unpolluted by city light, Elara sat alone with her rifle. She ran the cloth down the barrel, each stroke deliberate, her mind drifting to another mountain range decades earlier. She pictured her grandfather's weathered hands guiding hers on a wooden stock, his voice calm and insistent. "Discipline is survival." For the first time in weeks, her lips curved into a faint smile. He would have approved, yet even as she scrubbed the last trace of carbon away, she knew this wasn't the end. Success painted a target as clearly as failure. There would be others, commanders, rivals, doubters, waiting to test her again. She didn't fear it. The Valley had already heard her answer once, and if the world demanded it, it would hear it again. In the days that followed, Camp Resolute shifted into a different rhythm. What had once been a compound thick with rivalry and doubt now pulsed with anticipation and respect. Soldiers who had barely acknowledged her before began drifting to her tent, not out of obligation but out of hunger for insight. They asked about wind calls, terrain traps, angles of fire. They listened in hushed tones, as if approaching not just an instructor, but a soldier who had proven lessons with sweat, blood, and steel. The 6 captured insurgent leaders were moved out under heavy guard. Helicopters carried them to an undisclosed facility, rotors beating against the dawn sky. Word spread quickly that the intelligence recovered from their documents and devices was unraveling networks across the region. Several coordinated bombings were prevented before they even left planning stages. For the task force, it was validation that their suffering, their endurance, had made a measurable difference. Elara observed all this with a detached calm. She had learned long ago not to chase headlines or decorations. What mattered was that fewer names would be written on memorial walls. Yet even she could not ignore the shift in how people treated her. The wary glances of days past had been replaced with nods of respect that came without hesitation. One evening, while she cleaned her rifle under the glow of a lantern, Chief Reyes approached. He carried 2 mugs of bitter instant coffee, setting one beside her without asking. He studied her for a long moment before speaking. "You know what you did out there, Hawk? You didn't just silence a valley, you silenced every doubt some of these men had about working beside you. That's not easy." She blew gently into the chamber before replying. "Doubt doesn't disappear overnight. People forget quickly. There'll be another test." "True," Reyes admitted, "but you've built something they can't erase. You put rounds where they counted, and when men saw that, it changed them, even Harlow." She smirked faintly, though her eyes never left the rifle, especially Harlow. The Admiral himself had become more measured since the mission. He no longer barked dismissive remarks in her presence. Instead, he engaged in tactical debates, sometimes even soliciting her assessment before making a decision. The shift was subtle but unmistakable. It wasn't friendship, but it was respect born of necessity. A week later, orders arrived from higher command. Elara was summoned to the operations center, where Harlow, Collins, and Reyes stood waiting. On the table lay a sealed envelope stamped with official insignia. Harlow opened it and read aloud, "Staff Sergeant Elara Kross is hereby reassigned to Fort Liberty for duty as an instructor in the Advanced Precision Marksman course, effective immediately." The words hung in the air. For a moment, even Elara felt the weight of them. She had expected more missions, more nights in cold hides, not a posting back stateside. Teaching meant stepping away from the front lines, exchanging danger for classrooms. She met Harlow's eyes, searching for motive. He answered with a slight nod. "It's not punishment, it's recognition. They want your skill passed on, and frankly, after what I've seen, I support it." Collins clapped her shoulder. "You'll shape the next generation, Hawk. That's as vital as any firefight." Reyes added with a grin, "Don't think you're done proving people wrong. Stateside doubters can be louder than bullets." Elara gave no outward sign of how she felt, but later, as she packed her gear, her thoughts churned. Leaving the battlefield was not easy. The rifle, the wind, the solitude of a hide, these were her constants. To trade them for lecture halls and training ranges felt alien. Yet she also remembered the eager faces of young soldiers who had sought her advice after the mission. Perhaps teaching was not abandoning the fight, but multiplying her reach. On her last night at Camp Resolute, she climbed the ridge one more time, carrying only binoculars. She watched the valley in silence, remembering each shot, each decision. The stars glittered above, indifferent yet eternal. She thought of her grandfather again, of his belief that knowledge wasted was a betrayal. Passing on skill was not surrender, it was legacy. At dawn, helicopters lifted her out. As the base shrank beneath her, she felt both relief and unease. Ahead lay new battles of a different kind, shaping minds, breaking old biases, ensuring precision lived beyond her own trigger finger. When the aircraft landed stateside weeks later, she stepped onto familiar soil with a duffel over her shoulder and her Barrett cradled like an old companion. Fort Liberty loomed ahead, not as a battlefield, but as a proving ground of another sort. Waiting at the gate were officers in dress uniforms, clipboards in hand, prepared to usher her into a role no woman had yet held in that program. She tightened her grip on the rifle case. Combat had tested her. Now instruction would test her patience. She was ready. The first morning at Fort Liberty broke crisp and cool, the mist still clinging to the pines surrounding the firing ranges. Elara Kross stepped out of the barracks, carrying the long black rifle case that had become her signature. Soldiers already milling about stopped to watch as she crossed the gravel path toward the training complex. Most had read the orders that a new instructor was arriving. Fewer had expected her. Inside the classroom, cadets straightened as she entered, some with expressions of curiosity, others with doubt barely concealed. Young men and women in pressed uniforms eyed the case she carried, perhaps wondering if the stories they'd heard about Afghanistan were embellished. She caught the skepticism in their glances, the quiet smirks shared between a few in the back row. The battlefield had changed, but the challenge remained the same. She set the rifle case gently on the instructor's desk and addressed them without preamble. "My name is Staff Sergeant Elara Kross. For the next 12 weeks you'll learn the discipline required to earn this course patch. Some of you will make it, some won't. That depends entirely on how much you're willing to sacrifice." Her tone was steady, neither harsh nor indulgent. She had no interest in winning them with charm. Instead, she spoke with the gravity of someone who knew what it cost to miss a shot. The first week revealed the depth of resistance. During ballistics theory, one cadet raised his hand, smirking as he asked, "Ma'am, no offense, but isn't this the kind of work better left to guys who can carry the load? Those rifles aren't exactly built for lighter frames." the room chuckled. Elara let the laughter fade before responding. She stepped calmly to the front row, lifted his issued rifle from its rack, and placed it flat across his desk. "Pick it up. Fire position now." The cadet fumbled into prone stance, the weapon trembling slightly in his grip. Elara knelt beside him, adjusting his elbows with sharp precision. Then she spoke just loud enough for the rest of the class to hear. "This rifle doesn't care if you weigh 100 pounds or 300. It doesn't care if you've got broad shoulders or narrow ones. It only cares if you respect the fundamentals: stability, breathing, trigger squeeze. Everything else is noise." The silence afterward was telling. From that day forward, the jokes stopped. Still, teaching demanded a different endurance than combat. Instead of minutes of perfect focus under fire, she endured hours of correcting stances, reviewing calculations, repeating lessons, until exhaustion dulled even her own patience. She reminded herself often that every repetition mattered. A student who absorbed discipline in the classroom might one day survive on a battlefield because of it. By week 4, progress began to show. Shots that once scattered across targets now grouped tighter. Cadets who had struggled with wind calls began to anticipate gusts before they arrived. Elara's methods, demanding but fair, were seeping into them. Yet the hardest moment came midway through the course. The instructors staged a stress test. Cadets were marched through mud, drenched under water hoses, then forced to fire within seconds of hitting the range. Fatigue and adrenaline shredded composure. Misses piled up. One young soldier, barely 20, broke down in frustration after missing 3 consecutive shots. He slammed his rifle against the dirt, muttering that he wasn't cut out for it. Elara knelt beside him, her voice firm but not unkind. "You think the battlefield waits for you to feel ready? Fatigue, fear, confusion, those will always be there. You master them, or they master you. Now breathe, reset, show me you can fight back." The cadet wiped mud from his face, steadied himself and squeezed. The round struck the steel with a satisfying clang. The relief on his face told her the lesson had sunk deeper than any lecture. By the time the final week arrived, the class had transformed. They no longer saw her as an anomaly, but as the standard they were expected to follow. When she demonstrated long-range drills, they watched with reverence, no longer doubting the lean figure behind the rifle. Her credibility no longer came from Afghanistan alone. It came from every correction, every challenge, every demand she placed on them until they could perform under pressure. Graduation day was held under a cloudless sky. Families lined the bleachers, brass polished, uniforms crisp. The cadets stood in formation, waiting for patches that marked them as precision marksmen. Elara walked the line with other instructors, pinning badges, offering firm handshakes. The young soldier who had once nearly quit met her eyes with gratitude. When the ceremony ended, the commandant pulled her aside. "You've done what we hoped, Kross. These cadets aren't just better shooters, they're sharper soldiers. That's your doing." She gave a short nod, feeling neither pride nor modesty, but a quiet sense of completion. This was the fight she hadn't expected. To win trust not through combat, but through shaping the next wave. That night, long after the parade field emptied, she sat alone on the range. The echo of shots from weeks of training still lingered in her mind. She closed her eyes and remembered the valley, the cliffside perch, the moment when arrogance had tried to strip her of her place. That moment had carried her here, and she knew it would carry her further still. Fort Liberty's ranges grew quieter after the cadets graduated, but Elara's role did not diminish. Her presence at the Advanced Precision Marksman course quickly became more than that of another instructor. Command began requesting her input on curriculum changes, citing her ability to merge battlefield lessons with classroom instruction. She found herself drafting proposals late into the night, her notes covered in diagrams of wind patterns, slope angles, and shot timing under stress. It was work she never imagined embracing, yet she felt the same focus she once carried in combat. Each syllabus she revised, each drill she designed, was another way to prepare soldiers for conditions they could not yet imagine. The rifle was no longer only in her hands, it echoed through every trainee she influenced. Her reputation spread beyond the base. Units arriving for refresher courses asked specifically for the Hawk. Rumors about the woman who had silenced doubters in Afghanistan reached officers who had never set foot in the valley. Some came curious, others skeptical, but none left unimpressed. One afternoon, while reviewing a class on urban hides, she was summoned to headquarters. There, in a polished office lined with flags, she found an unexpected figure waiting, Vice Admiral Richard Harlow. The last time she had seen him, he stood on Afghan soil, his pride wounded but his words softened by her performance. Now he looked different, not only in uniform but in demeanor. The arrogance that once clung to his every gesture had faded into a kind of hardened humility. "Staff Sergeant," he greeted, offering his left hand. She shook it without hesitation. They sat across from each other at the conference table. Harlow wasted no time. "Your actions overseas forced me to confront a failing in our system. For years we measured capability through tradition rather than performance. I allowed those biases to blind me. I'm pushing for a change, selection based on merit without prejudice, and I want you involved." Elara listened, her expression unreadable. She remembered too well the moment his hand closed on her barrel, the disbelief in his eyes. But she also remembered his salute after her final shot, the quiet acknowledgement in the valley. People could change, and perhaps his transformation was proof. "What exactly are you asking?" she said finally. "A council is forming," he explained. "Senior officers, training commanders, policy advisors. We're re-evaluating joint force marksmanship standards. I want you at that table. Your voice, your perspective, those carry weight now." The request startled her more than any compliment. Teaching cadets was one thing, shaping doctrine was another. She thought of her grandfather's insistence that skill meant little if it wasn't passed on. Maybe this was the next step in honoring that lesson. "I'll contribute," she agreed, her tone even, "but I won't temper my opinions. If I see something broken, I'll call it out." Harlow allowed himself the faintest smile. "That's why I asked." Their meeting marked the beginning of a new chapter. Elara found herself flying to conferences, standing in front of panels filled with stars and ribbons, describing the realities of dust, wind, and exhaustion that couldn't be found in manuals. She explained how arrogance killed, how dismissing a soldier because of gender or background risked more than morale. It risked lives. Not everyone welcomed her candor. Some bristled, muttering that she was a symbol rather than a soldier. Yet as she laid out the data, recounting engagements backed by after-action reports, resistance weakened. One by one, hardened officers had to admit the result spoke louder than tradition. Back at Fort Liberty, her cadets noticed the shift as well. Lessons grew sharper, infused with examples from her new work. When they asked about policy debates, she shared what she could, reminding them that the battlefield wasn't only physical, it was also fought in rooms where decisions shaped who got deployed and who was trusted with critical roles. Late one evening, she walked the empty range alone, the echo of past classes still ringing in her ears. She set her Barrett on the bench and looked downrange at the steel plates glinting in the moonlight. She thought about the 6 targets in Afghanistan, the line she had drawn in the sand, and how that single moment had rippled outward into something larger than herself. Her phone buzzed with a message. It was from Reyes, still deployed overseas. "Captured 2 more HVTs today. Your methods saved our skin again. Thought you should know." She exhaled slowly, a quiet sense of connection threading across continents. What she had begun in one valley now lived on through others, carrying her lessons. In time, a formal announcement arrived. Elara Kross was to be the first female designated as a primary instructor for the Advanced Sniper program, not temporarily but permanently. The wording was dry, bureaucratic, but the meaning was clear. The barrier had been broken. At the small ceremony Harlow himself attended, his wrist now fully healed, but his memory intact. When he pinned the insignia on her uniform, he spoke just loudly enough for those nearby to hear. "You forced me to change, Kross, and for that the entire force owes you." She gave no reply, only a steady look that carried both acknowledgement and warning. Change was not a finish line, it was a fight that had to be defended. That night, as the base settled into darkness, she returned once more to her rifle. She ran a cloth along its length, thinking not of past battles, but of future generations who would sight through their scopes and trust their calculations. The echo of steel ringing in valleys would continue long after she set the weapon aside. For the first time, she allowed herself to believe her role was no longer simply about hitting targets. It was about ensuring that precision, discipline, and respect became the standard, no matter who carried the rifle. And in that realization, she found a peace she hadn't expected. Winter descended on Fort Liberty with a cold that cut through uniforms, yet the ranges never rested. Recruits stomped their boots against frozen ground, instructors barked through steaming breath, and the crack of rifles rang against a sky washed pale. Elara Kross stood at the line, watching a trainee line up his shot, her eyes sharp, her posture steady. Even as an instructor, she never softened her standards. Every squeeze of a trigger demanded the same gravity she carried in combat. But life beyond the firing line was changing. Her name began to surface in publications that usually ignored enlisted instructors. Articles described her as a symbol of resilience, though she bristled at the word. She hadn't set out to be anyone's banner. She had simply done her job when arrogance tried to take it from her. Still, she recognized that symbols mattered. If her story opened doors for others, it was worth enduring the spotlight. Letters arrived from families of soldiers she had trained. One wrote that her son had survived his first deployment because he remembered her voice in his head telling him to slow his breathing before firing. Another said her daughter came home brimming with confidence, no longer doubting her place on the team. These letters struck her harder than any medal. They were proof that what she passed on lived far beyond her own rifle. Yet not all recognition was easy to accept. One afternoon she received word that her grandfather Leonid had taken ill. The man who had first placed a rifle in her hands, who had whispered lessons under Montana skies, now lay confined to a hospital bed. She requested leave and flew across the country, the transition from military cadence to civilian quiet almost disorienting. She found him frail but alert, his eyes still sharp beneath wrinkled lids. Medals from another lifetime hung on the wall beside his bed, Soviet emblems dulled with age. Beside them sat a framed clipping about Elara's Silver Star recommendation. He gripped her hand with what strength remained. "You carried it further than I ever could," he whispered, his accent still thick despite decades in America. "I taught you the mechanics. You taught yourself the courage." She felt words lodge in her throat, but she forced them out. "I just tried to make sure they listened, Didushka, that they respected what the rifle means." His gaze flicked to the medal on the nightstand, then back to her. "Respect is earned in silence, with patience. You remembered that." 2 weeks later, he passed quietly in his sleep. At the funeral, Elara stood in uniform, the folded flag clutched against her chest. The rifle case rested at her side, not for ceremony, but because she couldn't imagine facing the world without it. As taps played, she felt a weight heavier than combat settle over her. She had lived her life proving herself to others. Now she carried the responsibility of honoring him by ensuring others never had to fight that same battle of doubt. Back at Fort Liberty, grief became fuel. She threw herself into teaching with renewed intensity, demanding more from her cadets, not out of cruelty, but because she knew what awaited them. She explained wind not as a number, but as a language to be read. She spoke of patience as survival. She told them arrogance could kill faster than a bullet. They listened, not because of her rank, but because every word carried the weight of lived truth. Meanwhile, Admiral Harlow's reforms gained traction. Selection boards began incorporating blind evaluations, scoring shooters on performance without knowing their identities. The results were undeniable. Soldiers who might once have been overlooked began rising through ranks, their skill impossible to dismiss when stripped of prejudice. Harlow credited Elara publicly during a conference, stating that without her, he would never have seen his own bias. The acknowledgement reached her through colleagues who sent recordings of the speech. She watched it once, then closed the file. She didn't need his praise. She needed the changes to endure long after both of them were gone. Months rolled into years. Classes came and went. Some cadets stayed in touch, sending updates from deployments, photographs of their teams, notes of thanks. Others vanished into the churn of operations, their names resurfacing only in casualty reports. Each loss struck her, but she reminded herself that without training, there would have been more. One evening, after dismissing her latest class, she walked the empty range under fading light. She set up her Barrett, though she no longer needed to prove anything. It was ritual, meditation. She sighted a steel plate shimmering at distance, adjusted for the dusk wind, and fired. The clang echoed like memory, carrying her back to the valley, to the day arrogance had tried to strip her of her place. She lowered the rifle, exhaling slowly. That moment had begun as a clash between pride and skill, but it had become something greater. It had shaped policy, trained generations, and reminded everyone who heard the story that respect belonged to performance, not to assumptions. Her phone buzzed.
A message from Reyes overseas. New class of snipers saved a patrol today. They used your methods, Hawk. You're out here even when you're not.
She allowed herself a rare smile. Legacy wasn't medals pinned to a chest. It was being present in shots fired by soldiers she had never met, in lives spared by lessons whispered across ranges. As night settled, she packed her gear, slinging the Barrett across her shoulder. The weapon had traveled from Afghan cliffs to American classrooms, from her grandfather's lessons to cadets who would carry it further still. She whispered to herself the phrase that had anchored her through every trial: precision saves lives. And as she walked off the range, the echo of steel still ringing faintly in the distance, she knew her grandfather's voice would always be with her, steady, patient, reminding her that silence and accuracy would outlast every doubt. The fight had begun with a hand grabbing for her rifle. It ended with countless hands, steady on their own weapons, guided by the lessons she had forged through resistance. Elara Kross had not only defended her place, she had redefined it. The story of Staff Sergeant Elara Kross does not end on a windswept Afghan ridge, nor even on the quiet training ranges of Fort Liberty. Her journey is the proof that a single moment of defiance, one soldier refusing to let arrogance take her rifle, can ripple outward to change far more than a mission. It can shift an entire institution. Think back to that first instant when the Vice Admiral's fingers curled around her Barrett. In that flash of tension, rank collided with experience, ego pressed against discipline, and the air grew heavy with unspoken challenge. 40 men in that briefing room held their breath, unsure whether the enlisted sniper would back down or whether she would dare to hold her ground. She did more than resist. She reshaped the course of the operation. The 6 shots she placed on steel in front of half the base were not only demonstrations of skill, they were declarations. Each impact silenced years of doubt. Each ring of steel carried a message that cut through generations of prejudice. Ability is not measured in tradition or assumption, but in results. But Elara's true victory did not come from humiliating a superior officer. It came from what followed, when the task force rolled into the valley and captured those 6 insurgent leaders. Her precision kept comrades alive. When cadets at Fort Liberty repeated her methods and survived their own deployments, her influence echoed across continents. When policymakers rewrote selection boards to strip away bias, her defiance became a catalyst for reform. And perhaps most importantly, when her grandfather closed his eyes for the final time, he knew the lessons he had passed on under the Montana sky had not been wasted. His granddaughter had carried them into another century, another army, another war, and made them matter for soldiers he would never meet. That is the essence of legacy. It is not the medals pinned to her chest or the articles written in military journals. It is the unseen lives saved by shots she never fired herself, because those who came after her had learned discipline, patience, and respect from her example. The story of Elara Kross is also a reminder to all of us. The fight for recognition does not always happen under fire. Sometimes it happens in briefing rooms, on training ranges, or in quiet moments where doubt whispers that you don't belong. Her answer was simple and unyielding. Prove it with precision. Let skill speak louder than prejudice. So as you finish this account, ask yourself, where in your own life have you been told to let go of the metaphorical rifle? Where has arrogance tried to strip away what you've earned? And when that moment comes, will you hold firm, breathe steady, and place your shot exactly where it needs to land? On VeteranBiker, we share these stories not to glorify war, but to honor resilience, discipline, and the refusal to be defined by doubt. Every tale we bring you carries a truth forged by those who walked into fire and came back with lessons worth remembering. Now we want to hear from you. Where are you watching from? What part of Elara's story struck you most? The confrontation in the briefing room, the impossible shot across the valley, or the quiet resolve she carried into the classroom? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. We read them, we value them, and we salute every one of you who keeps these stories alive. If this story moved you, if it made you think differently about what real strength looks like, support us by subscribing to VeteranBiker. Your subscription helps us keep telling stories that matter, the ones that rarely make the headlines but should never be forgotten. Hit that like button, share this with someone who needs to hear it, and join a community that believes courage comes in many forms. And as this video closes, don't click away just yet. On the screen, you'll see more stories waiting, accounts of grit, sacrifice, and triumph that deserve your attention. Pick one, let the echo of history carry you forward, and ride with us into the next chapter. Because here at VeteranBiker, we don't just tell war stories, we carry legacies. Thank you for watching, thank you for listening, and above all, thank you for keeping the flame of respect alive. Subscribe now, share your voice in the comments, and stay with VeteranBiker for the stories that matter most.